There's an old letter long attributed to the famous Jewish historian Flavius Josephus that offers a striking portrait of a man so extraordinary he couldn't be ignored. His words describe someone whose presence and actions left a lasting mark. Many believe that man was Jesus Christ. For years, critics argued that there was no credible mention of Jesus outside the Bible. But this ancient text flipped the script. Its discovery added a new dimension to the conversation, one that continues to challenge skeptics and stir deep conviction among believers. So what exactly did Josephus say? And why does this letter still spark debate after so many centuries? If these kinds of stories interest you, don't forget to subscribe. We've got more thought-provoking videos coming your way. Flavius Josephus wasn't just another name in history books. Born in Jerusalem around 37 AD, he lived through one of the most turbulent periods in Jewish history, a time of revolts, Roman oppression, and massive change. Raised in a devout Jewish household and trained in religious law, Josephus initially joined the Jewish resistance against Rome, but fate took a surprising turn when he was captured. Instead of being executed, he somehow earned the trust of his Roman captors. Over time, he transitioned from prisoner of war to trusted advisor and eventually became a Roman citizen. What made Josephus truly remarkable was his relentless commitment to documenting the world around him. In an era with little concern for accuracy, he stood out for his careful attention to detail. His most influential works, The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews, remain essential sources for anyone seeking to understand the political, religious, and cultural landscape of the first century. Historians today still turn to his writings, not just for what he recorded, but for how he recorded it, with clarity firsthand, insight, and surprising neutrality. Josephus wasn't a Christian. He wasn't writing to promote any religious agenda. His goal was to preserve the story of his people and his time. That's precisely why his references to Jesus are so significant. Among his writings is a now famous passage called the Testimonium Flavianum, found in Antiquities of the Jews. In it, Josephus speaks of a man named Jesus, known for his remarkable deeds, who was crucified under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Because these words come from someone outside the early church and from a respected historian, many view this as one of the most compelling non-biblical confirmations of Jesus' existence. The writings of Flavius Josephus have stirred discussion for centuries, not just because of what they contain, but because of what they might reveal. If Josephus truly wrote about Jesus, it changes how we view both history and faith. But what exactly did he say? And why do some argue the passage was altered or forged? To understand that we need to step back into first century Judea, a land under Roman control, restless and worn down. The Jewish people lived under harsh taxation and deep religious suppression. Protests were silenced. Uprisings were met with brutal force. Judea had become one of the empire's most difficult provinces to govern. In that storm of oppression and unrest, the Jewish people clung to hope, the coming of a Messiah. Someone who would rise up, cast off Roman rule, and restore the glory of Israel. Multiple factions shaped this era. The Pharisees held tightly to religious tradition, believing that faithfulness to the law would bring deliverance. The Sadducees, more aristocratic and politically connected, aimed to keep peace with Rome. The Zealots were ready for war, urging violent resistance. Meanwhile, the Essenes withdrew from society, entirely seeking purity and preparing for divine intervention. Into this volatile landscape stepped Jesus of Nazareth. He didn't come with weapons or politics. He came with words that spoke of love, mercy, and a different kind of kingdom. Crowds gathered to hear him. Some believed they saw miracles. Others felt hope ignite inside them for the first time. But that growing influence alarmed both religious leaders and Roman officials. To the Jewish elite, Jesus disrupted centuries of order. To the empire, he risked stirring rebellion. In a time when Rome crushed threats without hesitation, his fate was sealed. And this is the world Josephus lived in. As a Jewish historian caught between faith and empire, Josephus recorded what he witnessed in a land aching for justice and redemption. So when he mentions Jesus, it's not in isolation. It's within a world already burning with expectation, revolution, and fear. In such a setting, a man like Jesus, beloved by some, feared by others, was bound to face the empire's harshest punishment: crucifixion, a death reserved for rebels and traitors. Understanding the world Jesus lived in helps us grasp how a man like him could both inspire deep devotion and provoke powerful opposition. What makes Flavius Josephus's account so intriguing is that he wasn't writing to defend or attack Jesus. He was simply recording what he had seen and heard during one of history's most volatile periods. For centuries, the existence of Jesus was rarely questioned. His story was accepted as fact. But with the rise of scientific inquiry and modern skepticism, that certainty began to erode. Doubts emerged. Was Jesus a real person, or had the church constructed a legend over time? These questions sparked a wave of investigation. Critics pointed to the Gospels, noting they were written by Jesus' own followers, men with a reason to embellish or protect the story. From that perspective, the lack of outside non-Christian references became a key point of contention. Skeptics argued if Jesus truly worked miracles and gathered massive crowds, why weren't more historians of the time writing about him? This growing doubt led scholars back into the archives, searching for independent accounts that could either validate or challenge what the Bible said. And that's where the works of Flavius Josephus gained renewed attention. Unlike the Gospel writers, Josephus wasn't a believer. He had no stake in the spread of Christianity. He was a Jewish historian loyal to his heritage and aligned with the Roman Empire. That neutrality is precisely why his reference to Jesus stands out. To many researchers, it represented something rare, an outside voice, unconnected to the church, acknowledging that Jesus lived. But the passage famously known as the Testimonium Flavianum soon sparked controversy. When first rediscovered, some scholars questioned whether Christian scribes had modified the text during the Middle Ages. They pointed to phrases that seemed too flattering words, unlikely to have been written by a Jew who didn't follow Jesus. This led to speculation. Was the entire passage forged, or was it real, just later embellished? Over time, textual analysis and manuscript comparisons offered clarity. Versions of the Testimonium found in 10th century Arabic. Christian writings suggest that Josephus did indeed mention Jesus, but in a more restrained, neutral tone. These sources support the idea that while some glowing language may have been added by later editors, the core reference is likely authentic. Today, scholars continue to debate the details, but many agree on this. The heart of the passage, Josephus acknowledging the existence of Jesus, remains intact. And that makes it one of the most valuable non-Christian sources we have for confirming that Jesus of Nazareth was not a myth but a real historical figure. It's hard to dismiss the importance of a first-century Jewish historian referencing a man named Jesus, known for his works and crucified under Pontius Pilate. That's not the kind of detail easily imagined or inserted into history by chance. But it wasn't until long after Josephus's death that his mention of Jesus gained widespread attention. During the Middle Ages, Christian scholars began to study his writings more closely, especially Antiquities of the Jews. Within its pages, one passage stood out, a description of Jesus so vivid it soon became known as the Testimonium Flavianum. For many believers and historians alike, this was a turning point. Here was a reference to Jesus from outside the Bible, written by someone who wasn't a follower. It offered independent confirmation that Jesus had truly lived, taught, and died under Roman authority. Still, preserving this passage through the centuries wasn't easy. In a time when every manuscript had to be copied by hand, many documents were lost, damaged, or even altered. The survival of the Testimonium is largely thanks to Christian monks and scholars who painstakingly preserved Josephus's works. One of the earliest recorded versions comes from the 4th century, cited by Eusebius of Caesarea. A respected church historian, his writings played a key role in keeping the passage alive for future generations. When the Testimonium Flavianum resurfaced, it was hailed as groundbreaking. For the first time, a non-Christian text described Jesus not only as a historical figure, but as someone admired for his wisdom and miraculous deeds, and who had drawn many followers. Josephus wrote that Jesus was condemned to death by Pontius Pilate, a detail that matched biblical accounts and seemed to validate them. But with discovery came doubt. Could Christian scribes have tampered with the original text? Some phrases, particularly those praising Jesus as the Messiah, raised eyebrows. Critics questioned whether those words truly belonged to Josephus, a Jewish historian who never converted to Christianity. This suspicion led to decades of scholarly debate, yet other ancient versions helped restore balance to the discussion. One of the most compelling was a 10th century Arabic manuscript by Agapius of Hierapolis. His version still included a mention of Jesus, but in a more neutral tone, stripped of the overt praise found in later copies. This helps support the theory that while some embellishments may have been added over time, the core of the account likely remained authentic. Today, the Testimonium Flavianum continues to stand at the center of one of history's most fascinating debates. It doesn't just offer a potential confirmation of Jesus' existence, it challenges modern skepticism and invites both believers and critics to look deeper. Despite questions of textual purity, the significance of Josephus's account remains. Its detail, its origin, and its endurance make it one of the most important historical references to Jesus found outside of Scripture. What makes the Testimonium Flavianum truly remarkable is the clarity with which it presents Jesus not as a vague figure but as a man deeply embedded in history. According to Josephus, at that time there was a man named Jesus, a wise man. If one should even call him a man, he performed amazing deeds, taught the truth to those eager to hear it, and drew many followers, both Jews and Gentiles. He was the Christ Pilate, acting on charges brought by our leaders, condemned him to the cross. But those who loved him never abandoned him. On the third day he appeared to them alive again, just as the prophets had foretold. And to this day the group known as Christians named after him has not faded away. This single passage touches on nearly every major point found in the Gospels, Jesus' teachings, his crucifixion under Pilate, and the belief in his resurrection. And yet it appears in a text written by a non-Christian Jewish historian. That alone is astounding. In a time when independent references to Jesus were almost non-existent, Josephus not only acknowledged his existence, he described him as a man who performed wondrous acts and left a lasting impact on a growing movement. But that's also why the passage has drawn so much scrutiny. Some scholars question whether Josephus truly wrote those exact words, especially the part calling Jesus the Christ. As a Jewish historian who did not follow Jesus, it's unlikely he would have declared him the Messiah. That has led many to believe Christian scribes may have inserted or edited parts of the text during later transcriptions. Even so, when potential additions are removed, the core message remains. Josephus acknowledged Jesus as a wise teacher who was crucified under Roman authority and whose followers remained faithful after his death. What's more, Josephus doesn't frame Jesus in a negative light. He doesn't call him a fraud or a threat, as one might expect in a Roman-era account of someone who disrupted the status quo. Instead, he presents him with a certain quiet respect as a figure who deeply affected those around him. If Josephus truly wrote these words, even with some later embellishments, it places Jesus firmly within the historical record, not as a myth, not as a later invention, but as a real man living in a real moment in time, whose life would go on to shape the world. One of the most fascinating moments in the Testimonium Flavianum comes when Flavius Josephus refers to Jesus not as a typical preacher, but as a man known for great deeds, or depending on the translation, a doer of extraordinary works. This wasn't a casual choice of words. In fact, it adds a powerful layer of meaning to the entire passage. Josephus, writing not from a place of faith, but from the vantage point of a Romanized Jewish historian, chose language that set Jesus apart from the countless teachers and prophets of his time. To call someone in the first century a worker of wonders was no small thing. This was a world highly skeptical of miracle claims, especially among both Jews and Romans. For Josephus to use such a phrase suggests that Jesus' reputation had become so widespread, so persistent, that it couldn't be ignored even by those outside his circle of followers. Importantly, Josephus wasn't a Christian. He had no theological reason to exaggerate. If anything, his intended audience, educated Jews and Romans, would have been cautious, even suspicious of anyone claiming supernatural power. That's what makes this description so striking. It reflects what many people at the time seemed to believe, that Jesus performed acts which stirred awe, curiosity, and sometimes controversy. And that description lines up with the Gospel's accounts of healings, multiplying food, calming storms, and even raising the dead. Whether Josephus personally believed in the miracles or not, he documented what was widely spoken. Jesus was no ordinary man. This also helps us understand why Jesus drew such large crowds. In a region weighed down by Roman rule and spiritual longing, people weren't just looking for another sermon. They were looking for hope, something real, something powerful. And Jesus, in the eyes of many, offered exactly that. Josephus didn't elaborate or embellish. He simply noted what the people of Judea already saw. A man who left an undeniable impression. In that same passage, Josephus records that Jesus was sentenced to crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. This is one of the most critical pieces of the entire account because it directly aligns with what the Gospels record. Crucifixion wasn't a punishment handed out casually. It was Rome's harshest sentence used only for criminals, rebels, or anyone viewed as a threat to imperial stability. And Josephus once again reports it without commentary. No judgment, no religious undertones, just a factual record. Jesus was crucified by Roman authority. This neutral tone gives the statement even more credibility. Josephus wasn't trying to make a theological point. He wasn't trying to stir emotion. He was simply recording what had happened, what people knew without taking sides. That's why centuries later, these few lines continue to carry such weight, because sometimes the quietest statements speak the loudest. What makes Josephus's account so compelling is its tone measured, factual, and free of judgment. He doesn't argue for Jesus's innocence or guilt. He simply states that Jewish leaders accused him and that Pontius Pilate ordered his crucifixion. This neutrality reflects the role of a true historian, one committed to documenting, not persuading. And it's this objectivity that adds credibility to the story, especially when we consider the political climate of the time. Pontius Pilate wasn't known for showing mercy. He ruled Judea with a heavy hand, often resorting to violence to keep order. For Pilate to approve a crucifixion, he likely saw Jesus as someone dangerous, or at the very least a figure whose execution would satisfy the demands of Jewish leaders and help avoid further unrest. Crucifixion was not handed out lightly. It was Rome's way of dealing with rebels, those who challenged imperial control. And the fact that Josephus mentions it without embellishment or commentary gives even more weight to its historical authenticity. Even more telling is that Josephus's account doesn't stand alone. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around the same time, also records that Christ was executed during the governorship of Pilate. That convergence, two independent sources pointing to the same event, strengthens the case that Jesus' crucifixion wasn't a Christian invention. It was a real moment in history. What's equally important is what Josephus doesn't say. He doesn't attempt to defend Jesus. He doesn't condemn Pilate. He avoids religious arguments entirely. He sticks to the facts. That's what gives the Testimonium Flavianum its staying power, even with ongoing discussions about whether Christian copyists might have made small additions. The core reference to Jesus' crucifixion remains consistent and deeply credible. Still, the Testimonium Flavianum has been surrounded by controversy since its discovery. Scholars have long debated whether Josephus wrote the entire passage as we have it today, or whether certain phrases were later added by Christian scribes. The biggest point of contention: language. For example, when Josephus writes, "He was the Christ," or describes Jesus' resurrection, it feels uncharacteristic, especially coming from a Jewish historian who never converted to Christianity. Those specific phrases have raised questions. Were they part of the original? Or did they enter the text centuries later, subtly added to reinforce a growing theological narrative? It's important to understand the historical context. During the Middle Ages, Christian monks were responsible for copying ancient manuscripts by hand. Some may have been tempted, whether intentionally or unconsciously, to adjust wording that aligned with their beliefs. But that doesn't necessarily mean the entire passage is a forgery. Many scholars believe that while small additions may exist, the core of the account is genuinely Josephus's. One major piece of evidence is a 10th century Arabic version, recorded by Agapius of Hierapolis. His version is more reserved. It refers to Jesus as a wise teacher, but it does not include phrases like "he was the Christ." This supports the idea that Josephus did mention Jesus, but in a more neutral tone than what later versions reflect. Another key source comes from the 4th century. Eusebius of Caesarea, a Christian historian, cited the Testimonium Flavianum in his own writings. This shows the passage existed well before the medieval period, suggesting it wasn't invented by later copyists. Modern scholars have also used linguistic analysis, comparing the style and vocabulary of the Testimonium with other verified texts by Josephus. Many experts conclude that the majority of the language is consistent with his authorship, further supporting its authenticity. So while questions remain about possible edits or embellishments, the central message holds strong. Flavius Josephus, a non-Christian historian, recorded the existence of a man named Jesus who taught, influenced many, and was crucified under Roman authority. And that in itself is historically significant. Scholars widely believe that the original version of the Testimonium Flavianum likely portrayed Jesus in a neutral light, without religious declarations or doctrinal claims. And even after accounting for potential later edits, the core of the text still stands as a valuable historical reference. The ongoing debate doesn't diminish its significance. If anything, it reminds us how difficult it is to preserve ancient manuscripts over centuries, and how critical it is to analyze them carefully with historical and linguistic precision. Despite the controversy, one fact remains unchanged. A first-century Jewish historian mentioned Jesus, and that alone offers compelling evidence that Jesus was not a mythical figure, but someone who lived, taught, and left a deep imprint on his generation. To assess the authenticity of the Testimonium, scholars have applied various methods, one of the most important being linguistic analysis. By comparing the vocabulary and sentence structure of this passage with Josephus's verified works, researchers found that while a few phrases seem out of place, the core tone and style match his broader writing. That consistency supports the argument that the heart of the passage is genuine. Another method is the study of ancient translations, a 10th century Arabic version and an early Syriac version of the passage, both present a more restrained account. In these, Josephus refers to Jesus as a wise teacher who was crucified under Pilate, without mentioning him as the Christ or referencing a resurrection. This suggests the original version may have been more neutral, and that later scribes possibly expanded the wording to align with Christian beliefs. Additional support for Jesus' existence comes from Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius. Both writing in the 1st century also refer to Christ and his followers. The fact that their records align with Josephus strengthens the reliability of the Testimonium. These references show that Jesus wasn't just a character within Christian texts, but a person acknowledged in non-Christian historical records. Modern scholars like John Meyer and Louis Feldman agree. Even if later additions are removed, the core reference to Jesus likely came from Josephus himself. The controversial phrases such as "he was the Christ" can be set aside without undermining the passage's historical value. In short, the mention of Jesus in Josephus's writings remains a vital piece of evidence not just for his existence, but for the influence he had on the people around him. When we compare Josephus's account with the gospel narratives, striking similarities begin to emerge despite the fact that they were written by different people for different reasons. In the Gospels, Jesus is portrayed as a compelling teacher and miracle worker, someone who drew people in through his words and actions. Josephus describes him in a remarkably similar way as a man of great deeds, who won over both Jews and Gentiles. That overlap suggests that Jesus' reputation extended beyond his immediate followers. He was seen not just as a religious figure, but as someone who left a visible mark on the public consciousness of the time. Another point of agreement, both accounts state that Jesus was condemned to death under Pontius Pilate, following accusations from Jewish religious authorities. The Testimonium confirms this sequence precisely. Even after Jesus' death, the Gospels say his followers remained loyal, holding on to their belief in his resurrection. Josephus, in his own way, confirms this as well, stating that those who loved Jesus didn't abandon him after the crucifixion. These shared details, found in two independent sources, reinforce one crucial truth. Jesus of Nazareth was not an invention of faith, but a real historical figure who stirred hearts, challenged power, and shaped the course of history. What's striking in both Josephus's account and the gospel narratives is not just the agreement on facts, but the undeniable impact of Jesus himself. His message stirred such deep devotion that even his death couldn't extinguish it. That level of influence suggests there was something truly powerful behind his movement, and it's all the more significant, considering Josephus had no interest in promoting Christianity. He wasn't a follower, he wasn't a sympathizer. He was simply a historian tasked with recording the events of his time as impartially as possible. Yet his description of Jesus echoes key elements found in the New Testament: a wise teacher known for extraordinary deeds, crucified under Roman authority, and followed by people who remained loyal long after his death. Despite the differences in worldview, the core of the story remains the same. This alignment between secular and religious texts points to something deeper, a common truth that transcends belief. It shows that Jesus wasn't just a figure of faith. He was a real person whose life left a trace that can be found in both theological and historical records. Part of what makes the Testimonium Flavianum so influential is the reputation of the man who wrote it. Flavius Josephus was no Christian apologist. He was a Jewish historian born in 37 CE. Just a few years after Jesus' crucifixion, he belonged to the Jewish elite, was highly educated, and later became a Roman citizen after Jerusalem fell to the empire in 70 CE. From that position, he served as a historian for the imperial court in Rome. His mission wasn't to promote a religion. It was to explain Jewish history to a Roman audience accurately and without bias. That's why his mention of Jesus matters. If Josephus had wanted to avoid controversy, he could have simply left Jesus out. Early Christians were still viewed with suspicion by both Romans and Jews. But he didn't ignore the subject. Instead, he recorded it plainly, just as he did with countless other historical figures. He doesn't speculate about Jesus' divinity. He doesn't explore theological debates. He writes simply and objectively that Jesus was a wise man, followed by many and executed under Pilate. That tone, calm, factual, and without religious agenda, is exactly what lends his words so much credibility. Josephus's reliability as a historian isn't based on this passage alone. Many of his other accounts have been confirmed by archaeological evidence and historical sources. His descriptions of the Jewish-Roman wars, key cities, and notable figures have stood the test of time. So if he is trusted when documenting those events, why would we doubt him when he speaks of Jesus? For Christians, this reference has had a profound effect. For centuries, the Gospels were the only source used to affirm Jesus' life. But as modern skepticism grew, many began looking for external validation, something beyond Scripture. That's where Josephus's work plays a vital role. His writings offer a bridge between sacred tradition and historical documentation. They help position Jesus not just as a figure of faith, but as a real man who lived, taught, and was crucified under Roman rule. While belief in the resurrection remains a matter of personal faith, the crucifixion mentioned not just in the Bible, but in the writings of Josephus stands as a historical anchor. A fact recorded by someone who had nothing to gain and no reason to invent it, in that the Testimonium Flavianum continues to serve as a touchstone, uniting faith and history in one enduring voice. Josephus's account doesn't just confirm that Jesus lived, it reveals how his influence quickly spread beyond Jewish communities, drawing in Gentiles and crossing social and cultural boundaries. His teaching sparked a movement so powerful that not even death could silence it. For Christians, this is more than just a historical note. It's a tangible connection between faith and fact evidence that the man they follow wasn't merely a figure of Scripture, but someone recognized even by those outside the faith. Josephus, writing not as a believer but as a careful observer of history, acknowledged Jesus as a man of wisdom and great deeds. That alone gives the Testimonium Flavianum immense weight. And yet the debate hasn't faded. Skeptics continue to question the passage's authenticity, raising three main concerns. Possible edits by medieval Christian scribes, the lack of additional references in Josephus's work, and doubts about why a devout Jew would describe Jesus in favorable terms. Their most common argument is that phrases like "he was the Christ" or mentions of the resurrection were inserted by monks seeking to support the church's authority during the Middle Ages. Others question why more historians of the era didn't mention Jesus if his following was truly so large. But defenders of the passage point to solid evidence. Alternate versions of the Testimonium, such as Arabic and Syriac translations, omit the explicitly Christian language, but still include references to Jesus as a wise man, crucified under Pontius Pilate. These versions support the idea that the core account is genuine, even if some phrases were later modified. Historical analysis also shows that Josephus's writing style in the passage is largely consistent with the rest of his work. And other Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius also mentioned Jesus, reinforcing that his existence wasn't a fabrication. In the end, what emerges is not a perfect text, but a meaningful one. The Testimonium Flavianum reminds us of the complexities involved in preserving ancient records and the importance of examining them carefully. Even critics admit that a complete fabrication likely wouldn't have gone unnoticed for so long by so many scholars. Ultimately, the mystery surrounding this passage reflects the larger tension between faith and reason. For believers, Josephus offers a rare voice outside the Bible, one that validates the historical reality of Jesus. For skeptics, the questions around the text serve as an invitation to dig deeper, to challenge assumptions, and to search for truth. But regardless of where one stands, the influence of Jesus, the man described by Josephus, can't be denied. He walked the earth. He inspired a movement, and his legacy continues to shape the world even now. If this story has sparked your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to explore more historical mysteries that blur the lines between faith and fact, click the video on your screen now. We'll see you there.